So imagine, if you will, two clubs of personality. One club on this end takes cognition. It looks specifically at your manner of thinking, your manner of feeling. It is completely concerned with the inner workings of your mind. And then on the exact other end of the spectrum, you have the behavior club. This club simply concerns itself with how you behave, what behavior you exhibit, your personality, if you will. So on the right-hand side, we have the cognition club. This club isn't particularly popular at the moment, but it's growing in popularity. A lot more people are becoming interested in the inner workings of their mind. However, compared to the behavior club, this cognitive club is very much in the shadows. Most people who throw around terms like INFJ, who talk about the personality type, do not belong to this club. Many of them don't even know about the existence of this club. Because in the middle of these two clubs, you have a system that attempts to bridge the gap between the two, that attempts to assign behavioral stereotypes, behavioral associations and patterns to a set of cognitive parameters. However, this MBTI instrument, as great as it is not always entirely accurate. It's not 100% reliable. But many people who dip their toes into this MBTI field don't necessarily go further into exclusive cognition and oftentimes retreat right back into the daylight of behavior. But wait, if the system in the middle is the one which tries to assign cognitive functions to behavioral characteristics, what's the system over here? Well, this system uses the MBTI codes, but it is not MBTI. I cannot stress this enough. This system over here does not assign cognitive functions to your characteristics, to your type code, and therefore you should not assume your cognitive functions based upon the result you receive from this test. Heck, you shouldn't even assume your cognitive functions based upon your MBTI score. Never mind this score over here, because this score over here is a Big Five code. So what is the Big Five? Well, the Big Five is essentially the most successful and scientifically acclaimed personality system. But I use the term personality very loosely because it does not concern itself with the inner cognition of any given person. It does not concern itself with personality type per se. What the Big Five does, it looks at how you're behaving in any given moment and then assigns a score based upon that behavior. Now, this is where we get to the INFJ part, because the 16 Personalities website and many websites like it has assigned MBTI codes on top of a Big Five score. These codes, I cannot stress this enough, do not correspond to cognitive functions. This is not MBTI. So if you receive an INFJ code from this, do not assume you have an INFJ's cognitive functions. So the Big Five score is as follows: extroversion, openness, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and neuroticism. 16 Personalities piggybacks MBTI codes on top of this. Extroversion, introversion, well, this has stayed the same. However, openness on this test corresponds to intuition. Agreeableness on this test corresponds to feeling, therefore disagreeable is thinking. Conscientiousness corresponds to judging, and neuroticism corresponds to assertiveness versus turbulence. So despite the fact that in MBTI terms, this middle club here, and cognitive function terms, this club over here, the INFJ type is rare, in the behavior club, an introverted, intuitive, feeling, judging type, or more specifically, more accurately, an introverted, open, agreeable, conscientious type, is not uncommon at all. And heck, going back to this club over here, in the middle ground, many people are introverted, intuitive, feeling, judging types. However, very few people have introverted intuition, introverted thinking in a dominant stack, and extroverted sensing, extroverted feeling in their divergent stack. In cognitive terms, this is a rare type. In MBTI terms, when the instrument is successful, it's also a rare type. However, in behavioral terms, many people are introverted, agreeable, open, and conscientious. As such, many people will receive consistently, reliably, an introverted, intuitive, feeling, judging score, or more accurately, an introverted, agreeable, open, conscientious score. People who test as introverted, open, agreeable, conscientious are very likely to A, take charge of another person's emotions, be responsible for another person's emotions, whether from an extroverted feeling or introverted feeling standpoint, B, be very likely to be HSPs, highly sensitive people. C, be very likely, owing to the open score, to be very imaginative. You see where I'm going here, don't you? Many people will resonate with descriptions under the label INFJ. However, these descriptions oftentimes have nothing to do with cognitive functions. So if you are one of the many people who receive an INFJ result, chances are you're going to be in the behavior club rather than the cognitive club. And hopefully this clears up for you why a type you may very well receive from online tests is posited by some people to be rare, by statistics to be rare, for example, and stupid YouTube titles. And yet various comment sections, various forums, various dating sites seem to indicate the exact opposite. Because both of these things are true. Because there are two forms of INFJ. There's a cognitive INFJ, which is rare, which you are probably not. And there's the behavior INFJ, the introverted, open, agreeable, conscientious individual, who is relatively uncommon, who isn't exactly a rare type. I'm sure that you yourself are a rare, amazing individual. We all are. But in terms of having the corresponding cognitive functions within MBTI, you probably aren't an INFJ. And now I hope that this has cleared up for you why there seems to be this paradox whereby a rare personality type seems to be the most popular on the internet. It's because both these realities coincide with each other. The cognitive type INFJ is indeed very rare. The behavioral type INFJ isn't particularly rare at all. Many people, particularly the kinds of people who gravitate towards online tests in the first place, are going to receive an introverted, open, agreeable, conscientious score. Many people who are the victims of narcissists, many people who have savior complexes, many people who are just generally very sensitive, artistically inclined, are going to receive an introverted, open, agreeable, conscientious score. And this will very, very rarely correspond with cognitive functions. I'm sure there's 10% of people who receive an INFJ result from the 16 Personalities website who have the corresponding cognitive functions, but most people do not. So if you consistently receive this INFJ score from tests, well, you're an INFJ. Nobody can take that away from you. It just doesn't necessarily mean you have the MBTI version of INFJ's cognitive functions. And that's okay. You know that you're an introverted, intuitive, feeling, judging type. You know that you're an introverted, open, agreeable, conscientious person. Many people who take these tests on this left hemisphere aren't necessarily going to be lying. They're not necessarily going to be dishonest. They're going to be telling the truth a lot of the time. I'm sure that when you took this test, you were telling the truth. I'm sure these results indicate your behavioral score. I'm sure these results indicate this portion of your personality. However, these results do not indicate your cognitive functions. And that's okay, because the test didn't lie to you. You didn't lie to the test. You are an INFJ. You are an introverted, open, agreeable, conscientious person. And yes, many of these people will display certain characteristics. This is why the Big Five score works, because people who are in a group tend to behave in a similar way to each other. They tend to get into similar situations. And this is why the cognitive functions don't match up with behavior, because many people of different cognitive functions will be the same, and many people of the same cognitive functions will be very different. And as such, even though the INFJs in the behavior group are very likely to be a mixture of different types, such as ENTPs, ESFPs, ISFPs, INFPs, they will actually be more similar to each other. Oftentimes, they will have similar experiences to each other than the INFJs in group 2 who have the same cognitive functions. Because even though these people in group 2, the cognitive group, have the same cognitive functions, their behavior itself will vary wildly, because you cannot match behavior to cognition while retaining more than 50% accuracy, as with the MBTI instrument. And good luck doing a better job than MBTI. And this is why CPT doesn't look at behavior. This is why CPT does not assign superficial stereotypes to people based upon their cognitive functions, because it does not work. And channels and people that propagate stereotypes based upon cognitive functions aren't doing the world a service. And they are not helping people understand themselves better. And a possible exception for this rule are the channels who make comedy sketches based upon stereotypes, because comedy is comedy. Comedy uses stereotypes because it's funny. It is not trying to inform people of how their minds work. So if you've made it this far into the video, first of all, you're awesome. And secondly, you're probably wondering whether or not your behavior score corresponds to your cognitive score, or whether or not you receiving an INFJ result perhaps from a test, such as 16 personalities / Big Five, also have an INFJ's cognitive functions. Well, first of all, let me tell you that I have an INFJ's cognitive functions, but my behavioral score is extroverted, open, disagreeable, and conscientious. That is the 16 personalities equivalent of an ENTJ. So I'm in the opposite club. I'm somebody who has the INFJ cognitive functions, and even in MBTI terms, I'm an INFJ. MBTI works with me, but I receive a completely different behavioral score. So I'm in the opposite club here. But I have absolutely no desire whatsoever to try and reconcile my cognitive functions with my behavior, because these are two completely separate entities. And I have no interest in trying to straddle the gap between these two different mutually exclusive concepts. However, as a cognitive INFJ and a 16 personalities ENTJ, let me tell you what it's like to be me. My dominant stack is introverted intuition and introverted thinking. My magnetic pull, so this isn't an option for me, this is where I spend most of my time, this is my primary utility, is looking internally in a highly kaleidoscopic manner towards objective information within my mind. I'm piecing together new patterns, I'm theorizing, I'm philosophizing. You may very well hear descriptions or read descriptions online pertaining to introverted intuition as a unconscious function. If you resonate more with the descriptions of introverted intuition that posit a kind of hazy, dreamlike state, that posit the function as a source of random epiphanies and revelations, it's very likely your introverted intuition is unconscious. These online descriptions of introverted intuition that posit a kind of dreamlike function pertain much more to an extroverted intuitive dominance experience of introverted intuition. However, if your introverted intuition is highly conscious, if you are actively taking control of your internal lens to search across a vast portion of your internal mind to find abstract connections between various parts, if you are able to, for example, communicate to other people connections that they may have otherwise not thought of, if you are able to see hidden meaning in things fairly easily, if your role oftentimes in a conversation is to communicate these hidden meanings to other people, if you take in your stride the formulation of new plans, new contingencies, new ideas, new concepts, if you are highly original, you may very well be an introverted intuitive dominant. And if this originality pertains more to objectivity, such as theory, philosophy, creative writing, for example, composition, something whereby you're taking objective information and frameworking it in order to condense everything into this single framework, you may very well be an INFJ, because that is an example of introverted intuition connected to introverted thinking. With introverted intuition, the lens function as the dominant. So prioritizing the perception of novelty, the perception of your vast inner world, over the codification. If you are in fact an INTFS, the cognitive version of INFJ, you will also have an extroverted feeling authority. You will very rarely take charge of another person's emotions. You will very rarely feel responsible for another person's emotions. If you feel responsible for another person's emotional state, it's more likely your feeling is in a conversion position. And definitely check out my CPT Principles playlist above my head if you're interested more in the underlying terminology. So if you're a conversion feeler, you're more likely to take responsibility for another person's emotion. If you're an ETP, you may be very well feeling the other person's emotions and trying to cheer them up. If you're an INFP, you may very well be internalizing another person's emotional state and feeling your own approximation of them, seeing the other person as an extension of yourself and therefore prioritizing oftentimes their own health over your own. However, the INTFS does not tend to take responsibility for another person's emotions in this manner. Rather, the INTFS is someone who takes in emotional information in an observant capacity and then reflects upon it, tries to make sense of it. They may very well have a savior complex. They may very well want to help another person through a problem. Often we will. But we will do so in a more intellectual manner. We will try and find a solution to their problem. We very, 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 very rarely try to fix a person's emotions for their own sake. We very rarely consciously feel another person's emotions through our own approximation. What we do feel are the emotions of any given room, because we have mirror empathy more than we do have, in a conscious manner, relational empathy. And I do have a video describing and distinguishing both of these forms of empathy from one another. So the extroverted feeling authority of the INFJ takes in social information through an extroverted sensing, very specific and high magnitude lens, and then internalizes that information to reflect upon it. They seek to understand the underlying cause of any given emotional situation. And after they've understood this cause, they may very well try and act upon the situation. They may very well try and fix the person even. However, more often than not, the INFJ tends to be more conflict evasive and will very rarely put themselves in positions whereby they're subjected to continuous emotional disharmony. And if there is ever emotional disharmony, we tend to try and solve the underlying problem behind it. We very rarely let such emotional disharmony continue. If you tend to take responsibility for another person's emotions in the immediate situation in a highly intuitive and almost masterful manner, you're more likely to be an ENTP. If you tend to relate another person's problems to your own, if you tend to construct your own approximation of another person's emotional state within your own being, you are more likely an INFP. However, if you rather, oftentimes in a highly detached manner, observe and very much feel the emotions of another person, withdraw, reflect upon it, and then try and solve the very underlying issue behind the entire thing, then you may very well be an INFJ. And with extroverted sensing as your oppositional function, you may very well seek to withdraw from concrete reality oftentimes and prefer to spend time alone by yourself, absent stimuli. But this is not to say you have a surreal, dreamlike experience of reality. This is more common with types such as the INTP and the INFP. In the case of an INFJ, your extroverted sensing is still very intense. You are still an extroverted sensor. However, you are conservative in your use of extroverted sensing, and as such, you tend to abstain from a high degree of stimulation. If you are someone who enjoys crowds, if you enjoy prolonged bouts of intense stimulation, such as loud noises, concerts, if you're someone who can go extended periods in the concrete world without feeling tired, or even experiencing the concrete world in such a dreamlike manner as to not necessarily accrue an undue amount of fatigue, which is often the case with INFPs, for example, it is very unlikely you are an INFJ. INFJs tend to get tired out very quickly and very easily. However, when they are not tired out, when they have just initiated or entered into a concrete situation, the INFJ can actually be very intense. The INFJ does not have this vague, extroverted, intuitive gaze. They have a very intense gaze, and as such, when they actually engage with concrete reality, they tend to be quite intense individuals. They tend to engage with it fully. So consider an INFJ as someone who acts, especially in high stimulation environments, in very short but intense bursts. And if these four cognitive parameters match up to you, you may very well be an INFJ. There's no way to say for sure because the descriptions I've just given could still very much apply to other types. However, these are the general behavioral predispositions of these specific cognitive functions. And if you're interested more in the cognitive functions of the INFJ, I do have videos pertaining to them on my channel. So why are there two forms of INFJs? It's because there are two completely different systems. One system is behavioral, one system is completely cognitive, such as CPT, and then in the middle you have this kind of mesh of either MBTI or systems which seek to replicate MBTI, whereby cognitive functions are oftentimes inaccurately blended with behavioral stereotypes. And it is highly, highly possible, heck, I'd even say probable, that having received one score from one system, this actually lessens your chance of receiving that score from another system. If you are a cognitive function INFJ, the INTFS, it's quite unlikely that you will also receive an INFJ code from websites such as 16 Personalities, because this is a Big 5 score. And oftentimes that form of Big 5 score, the introverted, open, agreeable, conscientious, will not correspond with the INFJ's cognitive functions. And if you are receiving an INFJ result from these behavior tests, I wouldn't say it's likely that you will also get an INFJ score from a cognitive test. it is unlikely in this instance you will be an INTFS. And as such, the paradox of the INFJ being simultaneously the rarest type and yet the most popular type on the internet isn't going anywhere anytime fast. And just to reiterate, if you are in an INFJ behavioural club, this does not mean you are not an INFJ. And if you're in a cognitive club, this again does not mean you are not an INFJ. There are two different forms of INFJ. Some people, I'd say a minority, will inhabit both clubs, but the vast majority of people will be an INFJ in one club and a completely different type in the other one. So thank you again for watching. I hope it was enjoyable. If you haven't already subscribed, make sure to do so. And I'll be back, same place, same time next week. Take care.